Happy Tuesday. As you can see, I am in the house. My nephews are taking a nap. My niece is at summer camp. So hopefully I should be able to get through this video and be able to load it up in between them being awake and all of that. But today I want to talk about the basics of storytelling. And I want to concentrate on the 5 W's and 1 H. Now, I know a lot of creators talk about this, and really it makes sense because there is an emphasis and an importance to the idea of the 5 W's and 1 H. So we're talking the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how. Those are the 5 W's and the 1 H. And when you're creating a story, these are questions that you as the storyteller need to be able to answer. And also these are the questions that need to be relayed to your reader. Now, why is this important? It's really important, especially in the beginning. And I want to go more in depth in this book, Manga in Theory and Practice, The Craft of Creating Manga, because it has a lot of relevant information, not just for manga, but for storytelling as a whole. And the guy who wrote this is the guy who did JoJo's Adventure. And so even he talks about the 5 W's and 1 H. And when he talks about it is part of the establishing. And I found that interesting. Because essentially, what he's saying, and it's really important, is the basics of storytelling. And this is how I put it. The basics of storytelling is essentially establishing the story. That's why you have so many different types of writing books and creating books, because the whole thing is gearing you toward establishing story and establishing things like the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how. Now, in a visual medium of storytelling, the 5 W's and 1 H will be told at the beginning. So visually, on the first page, you need to answer these questions. Why? Because your readers need to be able to know what is going on right away. That's how you get them interested. It can be as simple as starting with a mystery. It could be, sorry, I'm thinking about it as in movies where you have the establishing shot. This essentially is the same thing because movies are a visual medium of storytelling. Comics are another visual medium of storytelling. So when you're telling a great story visually, everyone needs to know who is who. And when we talk about the who, we're talking about, of course, your main character. Well, maybe not your main character, but in this, we're thinking always the main character. Why? Because that's who the story is about. So who is your main character or main characters if it is more of an ensemble. You have to think about that. If you're starting with something like a mystery, then you may have think of the television show. What's the name of that show? CSI. You don't see the main characters of the show, who are the CSI technicians. Who you see are, the mystery element. And so when you're establishing the story, you're not necessarily establishing the who. You're establishing the what. So think about it that way. You don't necessarily have to answer the 5 W's and H, in order as it's written here. You can certainly start it any way you want, but the point is that the questions have to be answered in visual storytelling and even in regular fiction. The when, if it's a fantasy world and it's based off of medieval Europe, then, you can't have a cell phone because that would kill the when. If there's a particular place, like my trilogy starts in a dungeon. So we're establishing the where. We're beginning in a dungeon. Okay, so, you want to draw your reader deeper as they begin to go, okay, I see where we are. We're in a dungeon. Well, why are we in a dungeon? How do we get into the dungeon? Who's in the dungeon? Where is the dungeon? When did this happen? And if you don't begin to answer those questions, your readers are going to have a very unsatisfying story. I've learned, and I've become one of those readers who I've gladly stopped reading stories as soon as questions that I've had have not been answered. I talked yesterday about the Mr. Miracle series, where it seems to be a story that's going nowhere. And it started with a bang because it appeared to have this mystery. What's going on? Is Mr. Miracle crazy? Did he commit suicide? Did he succeed in committing suicide? Is he, trapped in his mind? Is this, what is really going on? And if you've never read that series, I would definitely suggest getting at least the first one, because the way that it is established, it's beautiful. It is a perfect mystery that draws you in and begins to make you ask questions. Now, you may have a story that is not geared toward that, but in all things, you're going to still have to answer questions, because people are going to need to know why it is important to read. We're going to talk about character. I would like to talk about character sometime this week, or maybe next week, but next week might actually be crazy because I'm preparing to actually leave. But I do want to talk about characters, because it's not just your main characters who are important, it is your supporting characters. And everything that I've talked about with writers knowing their characters and, storytelling and showing bad examples and things like that, it all comes together because it's really a matter of who the story is happening to. Because if people don't care about who the story is happening to, they won't care about the what is going on. They won't care about where it's happening, when it's happening, why it's happening, or how it's happening. And that's why I want to go over the Manga in Theory and Practice book, because it's the thing that he stresses as being, sort of the most important, as he lists it, your characters, because your characters are who your readers are sticking with. You may not do, this is particularly important, and we're going to talk about in fiction in particular. This is particularly important if you're doing first person. And first person is when we are inside the character's mind. I've read a lot of stories that were in first person. First person is my least favorite storytelling. And it's my least favorite because oftentimes the character that we are stuck with is incredibly unlikable. And I don't relate to that character, and being trapped in that character's mind becomes agony. So if you're going to do first person tense, then please, concentrate on character. If you're doing third person, or if you're doing like comic books where we have narration and things like that, and that's another thing that I want to talk about. Your narrator is a character. And you have to think about that too. Your narrator is a character. So when you're thinking about, like if you're doing comics or if you're writing a book or something and there is narration that is happening, you should think about giving your narrator a character and maybe doing a brief synopsis of who the narrator is. Now, the narrator could be the main character, but it might also be, someone outside of the actual story. I think of Rorschach as being a narrator, where he's talking about things going on, and he's talking about the characters and things like that. Now we see him in the story, but relative to the actual story, we're not seeing him nearly as much. He is just the storyteller. So think of it in that way. Your narrator is going to also be a character, depending, no matter who the narrator is. So that's one thing that I would say that you should definitely think about. And I guess, like overall, the thing that I keep trying to stress is how important knowing what you're doing, knowing what you're writing, knowing what your story is incredibly important. I can't tell you how many manuscripts I have sitting down because I started telling a story without really knowing the whole story, and now I'm stuck. You don't want to be stuck in the middle of a story with no idea of how it's going to end, because that is one of the key contributors to things like writer's block. I know it can be difficult, and I know it can be a difficult idea to think about not just writing, but when you're telling a story and you're establishing a story and you're answering a ton of questions and things like that, it's amazing how well sitting down and writing out everything is. I showed you some of my notebooks. I just went to the store yesterday and I bought a ton more of notebooks because there's a lot of things that I know that I'm going to need to work through as I piece together, especially a huge series that I'm working on. And even the trilogy. I keep calling it a trilogy, but it has even expanded in and of itself, the story, because there's still the prequel aspect and even sort of like the post aspect of what is still going on in the world as a result of the event that happens in the trilogy. So be prepared to think about the story in long term. And that's why one of the first videos, that I did was encouraging people not to be afraid of allowing their characters to grow, because a lot of our stifling, a lot of our character stifling, a lot of our stifling and story stifling and writer's block and things like that comes not just from not knowing, it comes from not knowing what you're doing, but it also comes from stifling growth and movement. So you always want, you're talking about establishing story, you always want to move forward. And think about it that way. You always want to move forward. Even when you're looking back, you're still looking back to move things forward. That was the beauty of because I'm gonna do it like this. Like, even if you're talking about a prequel and you're doing a prequel, I think I spelled prequel wrong. Oh my God. Even when you're doing a prequel and you're thinking about a prequel and you have your main story here, the goal of the prequel is to still move the story forward. And even if you think about it that way, your prequel is still moving things forward to get into the establishing story that's still moving things forward. I hope I'm not over complicating things, because the simple aspect is you want your story moving forward. And I think of this not just in terms of prequels, but just in terms too of things like flashbacks, because flashbacks, and I'll talk about flashbacks later, but flashbacks and prequels should be thought of in ways of helping to answer your 5 W's and 1 H. That is, I guess that might be some of the only things that I want to talk about right now. I could go on, but I don't want to go on. I really don't want to go on forever. I think that would just be insanity, and I don't want to push my luck with the boys actually taking a nap. But I'll leave you with the image of this. And the stress of just how important your 5 W's and 1 H is. And as we continue to go, we're gonna talk more about these things. And I want to talk about them more piece by piece. So I guess in a way I have a ton of plans, but we'll see what happens. Okay? Bye.